Because we front-loaded learning, right? Because students had said, well, I'm not going to create something with ChatGPT because I don't learn it then, right?
Then they were selecting what to showcase to demonstrate their learning.
A better way to think about it is amplified intelligence. So it's taking what you have and AI will turn a profit on your existing mental capital. And what does that mean?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Jason Gulia. So welcome to our podcast recording where we are going to talk about AI in education and specifically AI literacy. And so what I want to do is we're gonna have some topics to cover as we're talking about the future of education with everything that's going on with AI. But first, I want to do some very quick intros so people can get a sense of who we are and how we're coming at this technology and how we're thinking about it. So I'll go first, and then I guess I'll hand it over to you, Paul, and then we can hand it over to Eugenia. So my name is Jason Gulia. I'm a professor of English and communications at Berkeley College. So I'm in the U.S. on the East Coast. I'm not the California Berkeley. And I teach anything related to English and humanities, and often I teach our generative AI courses. And I also go around and I talk to a lot of educators and a lot of students about generative AI specifically and what it means for education. And Paul, I'll hand it to you.
Sure. Well, look, how to introduce yourself is always a tricky thing. I could talk about my family or my job or my religion or anything like that. But I think my number one claim to fame is writing a book with Jason on artificial intelligence and how to use it to teach evidence-based literacy practices. So that is sort of where I'm coming from. I'm a year 7 to year 12 teacher from Tasmania, Australia. I teach history and I like to think about artificial intelligence. And the most recent book was really the intersection of the two things we're discussing today: literacy, helping people read and write, and artificial intelligence.
I'm Eugenia Novokshanova. I teach English at Georgia State University Perimeter College. It's in Atlanta, the United States, on the Eastern Coast where Jason is. So I've been teaching freshman comp, I think the first and the second class only. So I think for the last like eight or 10 years. Before that, I was teaching English as a second language. That's why I started my first doctorate program, never finished. So I do have my PhD in metacognition in multimodal composition quite recently from 2023. And it's my first time meeting Jason and Paul in person. So I've been teaching with AI, teaching rhetoric and composition with I think for the last 3 years. And the more I teach, the more questions I have. So I'm here just to uncover everything with you guys. Not an expert, I'm a practitioner.
We all are. I feel like there are so few people who can really justifiably call themselves experts. So many of us, and I actually think this is a good thing. I think this is kind of like this is really useful. We're practitioners in the classroom, marching these things out and kind of like seeing what happens. And we have been for a while. I don't think there's any substitute, just good old trial and error and pivoting and going from there. Um, so cool, and I'm so excited, Eugenia. I know this is the first time we talked, and Paul, we've talked a bunch. But it's always such a pleasure to talk to you and hear your opinion and ideas. So what I want to do is kind of keep this an open conversation. So I want to start off just assessment and AI. So we can take that however we want, and then we can kind of naturally pivot to other things if we want. But either of you feel free to jump in, or I can offer my ideas. So what are your thoughts about the future of assessment with AI?
One of the things I've done is try and remove, now this will be controversial, and I should actually probably preface it, friends, by saying that when we talk about artificial intelligence, in many ways that's just the tip of the iceberg. And what is underneath the water is pedagogy and philosophy and religion and anthropology, all these huge domains of human pursuit that sort of crest up when we think about artificial intelligence. So it's worth saying from the outset that you can have a hearty disagreement, yet believe exactly the same thing about large language models. It's really what's under the surface that you're disagreeing on. So when it comes to my educational philosophy, I think students, especially the ones I teach, we're talking 13 years old to 17 years old, they need as many of the temptations and as many of the sort of pitfalls removed from the ecosystem as possible. So what I've actually done, and this has been part of a school-wide move, is we have moved away from technology. It used to be that a student was on their laptop 5 to 6 hours a day, and with that, there were some really significant possibilities. However, there are a lot of problems we were finding as well, a lot of problems that were actually quite detrimental to the learning. And for us, artificial intelligence wasn't the main reason we took students off laptops. However, it was part of it. It was also just that the average 14-year-old boy, and it was the boys in particular, they were just really struggling not to play Tetris while they were meant to be writing their essay. And sure, with a pen and paper, you might do some scribbling on your page, but you're not tempted to open up a new tab and play games. And so part of what we've done in sort of removing as many temptations as possible and just making the path forward as clear as possible is we've gone back to paper and we've gone back to pens. And what that does is ensure that the evidence of learning that we see in front of us is actually evidence of student learning. And that's something that's really exciting. We do use laptops occasionally, but for me, that's one of the things that people can do. Some people will hear that and say that's defeatist, that's regressive, that's going back 40 years and losing a lot of progress that we've made. And however, what I've found is it actually is one way, and a way that I use quite often, of just ensuring students aren't doing that cognitive offloading that we really don't want them to do. So that's one of the things that I've found is really working for me.
I wish I could do it. So that would be such an easy solution, just to go back. I have to be honest. So I have always been working with my colleague who's a kite. She's a true kite. She loves technology. She thrives on that. And I always felt like I'm a kite runner, trying to just control in which direction she goes with my questions. Why should I be doing that? Explain. Why do I need to do that? So if I could, I would stop time and just, I wish that AI never happened. And I could go back to pen and paper, and that would make it so much easier for me, but we can't do that. So being in higher education, I think that's when we get students from you, and it's nice that you can control them, because at least we make sure that we'll get students with some foundational writing skills. And that's where I think our job is to pick up on that and to teach them how they can now augment that with technology for different kind of transfer of genres and different writing opportunities outside of college. I think it's very important that K through 12 still gives us students capable of writing. So, and then we can already pick up from that. That's why I kind of stand on. I just wish I could go back to pen and paper, at least on the first diagnostic assignment, but I'm teaching split load online classes. That's why it's not possible. That's why I don't even consider that. However, I think it's important to have that writing sample where we can really see where the starting point, what students begin with, and then where they end. That would be without any assistance, right? That would be a true measure with or without AI. It doesn't matter. Technology doesn't really change the actual output. So I'm still thinking about that. I know Jason is giving a lot of work into assessment, and he has a lot to say about that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think this conversation emphasizes is how context specific our solutions are. And I think this is something that really doesn't get that much focus, I don't think, in the larger conversation about AI and assessment. You can find a lot of things out there about, this is how to make it AI proof or AI resistant or whatever. And what ends up happening is we talk in very general terms, right? So, Paul, your context might be very, very different than my context or Eugenia's context. And, this semester I'm teaching 2 in-person classes, and, we're there once a week, and we're inhabiting the same space for an hour, 15 minutes. And so that context flavors how I approach that course, and it should flavor it. And I'm also teaching 2 fully asynchronous online classes. And so for that, I'm actually not allowed to ask a student to go on a Zoom. I am not allowed to have a synchronous part of the course. It all has to be designed from the get-go so that a student can pop in whenever they have time in the middle of the night, whatever, and do it, whether it's from their phone or their tablet or their computer. And those contexts are just dramatically different. And I can do things in that in-person class that I can't do online, right? It doesn't move into that context. And the other thing that I think is so pivotal here is, Paul, your point about how it all comes back to pedagogy. And one of the things that has happened is that the technology can be a distraction, right? Obviously, we want to look at, we want to think about, how it's created, what people are doing with it. But in the end, I think that what we need to do is look as much as we can past it. One of the things I did this semester, which I hadn't done in previous semesters, is so for my in-person classes, we met on the first day. And for a really long time, I started to move away from this a couple of years ago, but for a really long time, I did what everyone did. I welcomed students to the course. They came in and we talked about the syllabus. I gave them a tour of Canvas, and then we chatted for a little bit and did icebergs, and we went on our way. And that was it. But one of the things that I did this semester for the first time is I said, we're not going to do that now. What we're going to do instead is I'm going to give you a question. And I asked them what motivates them to learn. And we talked about it. And I was very, very intentional in the conversation to front load learning, right? Get it at the front. And one of the things my student said to me was she raised her hand. She didn't raise her hand. She just talked because we were just talking in a natural way. And she just said, no one had ever done that before. No one had ever asked her about learning, right? They had told her what the course content was going to be and how to get an A. They had covered that before. And one of the things that happened was, so we had that conversation for about 5-10 minutes. And then we designed an AI policy together. And I recognize it's something that maybe you can just do in college, right? But we did it together. But what ended up happening was, in creating that AI policy, it was a piece of cake. It was extremely easy because we front-loaded learning, right? Because students had said, well, I'm not going to create something with ChatGPT because I don't learn it then, right? But what kind of needed to happen was I felt like we needed to wrench focus away from things like grades and compliance and all that sort of stuff. And for it seems so obvious in some ways to me. But for me, in my pedagogy, I'm trying to very insistently front load learning because, yeah, it doesn't deal with everything, but it puts the use of AI, if students are using it, in a context, right? And it opens that conversation, like saying, all right, you created an outline with AI, with ChatGPT or whatever program you're using. Did you learn it, right? Did it stick? And usually my students have a pretty good sense of that. And so I'm trying to front load assessment, whether it's online or in person. I'm trying to create assessments that front load learning in that way as much as I can.
I love that. And I think that vision or that desire to learn, that is a core component. In many ways, it's a foundation. Not too long ago on LinkedIn, I published a student AI use matrix. And sort of on the x-axis was vision and expectations, and the y-axis was skill. And a lot of us, when we're trying to get students to use AI wisely, we focus on the skill. Here's how to prompt, here's some different prompting frameworks, here's how to iterate, here are the different tools, etc. But really, the thing that lays a foundation for wise AI use is vision. And I would say specifically to your point, Jason, it's vision for growth, vision for learning. We think, we talk about our students as learners all the time. However, it's important to actually confront them with this information and say, guys, the whole point here is your learning. It's your growth. The point is not to do the task. The point is not to create a type of work. The point is actually to create a type of person who can think and argue and articulate their thoughts and research and ponder. And so if you've created the work, but you haven't created the person, then it's actually been a failure. We actually haven't achieved what we want to achieve here. So if you would imagine sort of one of those sort of right angle diagrams, if you want students to really excel in their use, they need to have that vision, specifically to see themselves as a learner and to see the goal as growth. Because if you do have that, to your point, Jason, actually offloading cognitively, using AI and churning out a piece of work and having no idea what it says and no ability to speak to it, but submitting it and getting an A, all of a sudden that is reframed as a failure, as something that is not achieving the goal of what we're trying to do here. So I couldn't agree more with you on that point.
I think what I hear here is the metacognition. So both of you talk about really being aware of your personal goals. And that's where I believe metacognition begins and ends, right? Whether you achieve those goals or not. Interestingly, I was just yesterday reading, I think it was a chapter from the book by That chapter was written by by Michael Neal. He's a big name in metacognition, metacognitive reflection, known for evidence-based reflection thing. And that is very interesting. Like, I think what we are facing now with assessment is what they faced back then at the end of 90s, early 2000, when they really talked about portfolio assessments and when they really talked about assessing process versus product with a focus on portfolio before e-portfolio even appeared. And what they did, they really collected these processes. That goes back, Jason, to one of your recent LinkedIn posts, that you talked about creating just more products through the process, where we apply the same grading philosophy to each of these. And what we create is really a wheel of more products where the assessment approach is the same. And that was interesting. Like Neil writes in that book that the way how they did it back then, they would collect these processes without really, at least I understood it that way, without evaluating each one separately. And then students were collecting these portfolios. Then they were selecting what to showcase to demonstrate their learning. So, and then they had to write that memo. That's when Neil didn't agree with them when he said, like, this kind of reflective reflection for presentation. So it has to be evidence-based, directly connected to your artifacts that you're putting in your portfolio, rather than just saying how much you have learned and how good the teacher is. So it's not really the evaluation of what you have done, but it's the proof where you really submit some evidence of where you started and where you are right now. And the way how they did it, they talked about the same issues that we have right now. Back then, it was like, what, 30 years ago, that learning needs to transfer across modalities, across media, across rhetorical genres. And that's what their portfolios had to demonstrate. And then I read about the new assessment techniques. I think it's called Queen Assessment, suggested by, I think these are the guys working on AI from Europe. I'm sorry, I don't know the name. So when they suggest that whatever students write, we twin it with some kind of other assessment like oral presentation or something else, which really goes together. For me, it's kind of building a portfolio, which makes sense if the audience is not even a teacher, but maybe it's a portfolio that you can then show to your potential job hires with focus on your soft skills. But then the question is, do we need to assess the steps in that process? That's the big question now that students are so connected to the grade as their only measure of success. That's really like switching the culture back and put it back on learning. Seems like it's such a hard task. It's hard to believe that 30 years ago they were doing that.
Yeah, I think that point picks up on so many of the possible solutions and how solutions, if we want to call them that, bring up more problems, right? In terms of scalability, one of the big questions, with focusing on process over product is how do you do that at scale, right? And there again, context comes back, right? The way that we talk about that, most of my classes are capped at 30 students. But I have friends who might teach 200, 300 students. Well, what does that look like now, right? Do we just have to go back to the old form? How can we change that if we can change it? And also creating that narrative of progression. Portfolios is one way to do it. There are a lot of other ways. And I think the other thing that I constantly see myself battling against, and I write about this a lot, and I think about it a lot, is how for many students, and my students included, see education as a form of transaction, right? That the focus is on grading, right? And I have students who will straight up tell me this, right? And I have this conversation with them that, they will say, I am here to get an A, so that I can get my degree, so that I can get a job. right? And I understand that. Like, I don't fault them for that at all. I think that's actually kind of a natural response to the system that has been created around them, which is that, it's about getting all the A's you can with as little effort as possible. And so one of the things I think this technology does, and this goes back, Paul, to your point about so much of it is pedagogy and thinking about education, that often there's something under the surface. And for me, one of those big things under the surface is the transactional model of education, right? That students want to maximize ROI because of that system. And so that failure or falling or just having a struggle of some kind is stigmatized. And one of the things that we need to do is we need to find systems and ways, and assessment is one way to do this, that encourage that, right? That actually don't penalize the student for not getting it the first time or maybe in the second time, because maybe they just need more time to do it. And I actually think that the conversation about assessment, it kind of conflates two things, right? I think there's a conversation about assignments, right? What assignments we are giving students, what are we asking them to do, how are we asking them to do it? So this is where we get to, essays versus portfolios versus whatever, right? And that's one conversation. And then one other conversation, which it's not quite distinct, but I think that it's not totally conflated with it, is the conversation about assessment itself, about grading. What should we be grading? What shouldn't we be grading? I still get a lot of pushback from my students, although that pushback I think is getting less over time, when I tell them, you're going to do this and it's for you. I'm not going to grade it. I'm not going to bring it. I'm not going to go and give that stamp of approval and say, all right, you get an A, right? And especially early on in the semester, I get a lot of pushback. And one of the things I'm doing this semester in my in-person classes, which so far has gone very, very well, is I do not grade any individual assignments. I do not give any percentages. I do not give any letters. I give completes and incompletes. There are ways that I do that to kind of reward effort, reward trying, reward try again. Now, some people might not be able to do that. We might not have the leeway to do that. But the only reason I bring this up is that I think we do have to start looking for ways to kind of decentralize grading, and decentralize the transactional model of education, because make it about learning. And I think that, yeah, it's not going to deal with everything, but I think that, in this conversation about pedagogy and educational culture, I think that transactional model gets in the way, right? Because as soon as a student thinks, well, I'm just here to get an A, well, using generative AI seems like a reasonable offload if it gets you that goal. But as Paul mentioned, right, for many of us, if we were assigning an essay, the goal often wasn't the essay. It was like the process that you go through and what you learn along the way. And so I think we need to find ways to focus on that process as much as we can.
Jason,
Yeah, I would agree. But this is also an interesting case study in how our view of artificial intelligence is really underpinned by several other ideas. I'm not one of those ungrading guys. I love reading your stuff, Jason, and I think you do it justice. You make a really persuasive case. However, it's not a particular road that I will travel down. I assign grades. I'm happy with the grades. I think you can create an ecosystem where grades work really well. But what you have is people on either end of that particular spectrum within the grading discussion who are both very excited about artificial intelligence and see enormous benefits for student learning and student academic attainment when AI is used wisely. So what we want to do, I think, is say that the AI space is open to people from every end of every spectrum when it comes to, are you grading or are you ungrading? Are you doing essays all the time, or are you providing 17 different ways for students to represent their learning? Are you all about direct instruction, or are you largely student-led? Are you project-based learning? There are so many different dichotomies within education, and what my passion is to say, no matter where you are on any of those, there are real tangible benefits for yourself and for your learners if you're able to use artificial intelligence wisely. And this was really the subject of the book we wrote together, wasn't it, Jason? I think there's no greater skill in life in many ways than being able to read and write. In fact, almost every other skill that will get you anywhere is founded on those skills, actually being able to read and write, and as a consequence of those, being able to think and speak and listen. These are the core foundational skills, and I think using artificial intelligence we can actually allow our students, especially those students who are struggling, maybe even the students who would never actually make it up to the level of education that you, Jason, and you, Eugenia, are actually in, the students who would never be able to go to college. We can actually use AI to help them read and write and think and listen. And for me, that is a super exciting vision. There's a lot of people out here in this space who would often argue that new tech has to be used to do new things. We're going to teach in the metaverse now, or it's going to be all about virtual reality, or we're going to take some wild new innovation that's based on this technology. And the simple case we made in artificial intelligence real literacy was that we can actually use artificial intelligence to do the basics of education better. Teachers in the sort of kinder to 12 space, they have a workload crisis. Students are actually decreasing in their ability to read and write. Using artificial intelligence, we can help teachers save time while improving students' ability to read and write. And for me, that just gets me really excited. It gets me really excited. And the good news is teachers of any subject, teachers of any pedagogical persuasion or sort of philosophical understanding, well, AI is open to all types, all comers. People from every end of every spectrum, and we can all use it to help save time, be more creative, and importantly, have a bigger impact in the classroom. So that's a vision for artificial intelligence that really gets me excited.
And I think what I hear is that we all talk about refocusing the value from product and efficiency to really understanding why you need to do it. Because now that AI can write for you, I can only speak about writing. I don't know what's going on in other disciplines like Comp Sci. So now that students know that AI can write for them, they really need to see the value. Why do they need to be able to write? And that's, I think, why maybe traditional assessment doesn't hold anymore, because students don't see the value of doing that if we continue to emphasize grades. And I think that's where the whole crisis is. I really see that the main thing is we really need to look at that compulsory education, that required subjects, at least in American institutions, where we really have everybody takes freshman composition, whether you want it or not. So it's a required subject. And then you will have a group of students, some of them really don't think they need it. And then it doesn't matter what you create in the classroom because they don't see the value of doing that. And then you will see, I did it for her, meaning me, when they really don't appreciate the process because, again, they don't see the value. We really need to focus that whole, now AI kind of makes it so obvious that the value we have been placing on education has been, I think, misaligned for quite some time.
Yeah, one of the things that AI has really encouraged me to think about quite a bit more is how we can't take things for granted, right? We can't take for granted that students know why writing is valuable. Sometimes we have to like actively talk about that, right? This is why reading and writing are pivotal. This is why they help you think. This is why they help you work through things. And I just assumed, even at the college level, students just understood that, right? Or understood that writing was valuable. And it's just not true, right? That we need to walk through that. We need to show them, why reading is valuable, why writing is valuable, why metacognition is valuable, right? Why reflection is valuable, right? I have students who, I might say, well, we're going to reflect on this exercise now and kind of debrief what happened. And some students who will just say, oh, this is just, we do it because it's an easy A, right? It's just to get some points, right? It's not like a real exercise. Like, no, but it actually really, really is important. Let's take it seriously. And so I'm trying to get myself to be better and better about that. And we have a few minutes left because I don't want to keep anyone's over. So I want to get all of us a chance to jump in. If there's any last thoughts we want to share for a few minutes, and then we'll be right at that half-hour point or so.
Sure. Well, look, let me give my final piece by saying I think there's a logical non sequitur at the heart of many people's understanding of AI. They're actually sort of putting 2 and 2 together and getting 6. And so we actually need to address a key misunderstanding. And many students have this, even some teachers have it. And that's that if AI can do something, we don't need to teach it anymore. I actually hear it all the time. I get it from students. So why am I learning to write an essay when AI can write an essay? We have it even on the level of spelling. Why do I need to spell when I know I've got spell check on my phone, on my computer? The key misunderstanding here is assuming that we don't need to do what AI can do for us. A better way to think about that, and I'm relying on a Substack here called the Absent-Minded Professor. I forget the fellow's name, but he's so good. He is so good. I love it. I read everything he writes. And he said, perhaps when we think about AI, a better way to think about it is amplified intelligence. So it's taking what you have, and AI will turn a profit on your existing mental capital. And what does that mean? It means if I can write well, I can get AI to write well. I consider myself a relatively good writer, and I know I can get AI to write well. I see students who are not good writers, and I tell you 100% they cannot get AI to write well. Why not? Because they don't have that initial intellectual capital. They don't have the initial intelligence that will then be amplified. I have the same thing with my wife, right? She's great at interior design. She's great at it. That used to be part of her job. If I used an AI tool to do interior design, it would be trash. It would be terrible because I have no foundational understanding of the basic components of interior design. I don't know what good looks like. I don't know what bad looks like. I have no way of evaluating anything. Yet, if I step out of that domain and then go into writing, well, then I'll actually do a pretty good job. The limit there is not my AI skills, it's my domain specific skills. And so I think that's a vision we want to cast with our learners. Say, hey, if you are so convinced that artificial intelligence is going to be a major part of your life going forward, it's going to be a major part of your vocation, it's not then that you stop learning the things that AI can do, it's that you get really, really good at the things that AI can do, because then you'll actually be able to use AI incredibly well and turn a big profit on your intellectual capital. So that would be my big encouragement. We don't need to stop teaching what AI can do. If anything, it's a great time to double down on the basics and get really good at them, because then we'll be able to be excellent in our use of artificial intelligence.
And Eugenia, I don't know if you have.
I think Paul did it very well. It's such a good conclusion because this is exactly as it should be. Yes, AI should be the amplifier and should allow us to go more, deeper, do better, rather than just let AI do it for us. There's no better way of ending this conversation, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. It's an additive, right? That there now is a push to get more domain specific knowledge and really just get better at things, right? I mean, it's the same thing with the teacher, right? One of the things I recommend my students think about themselves if they use AI is think about, if they're a teacher and now they have to teach this program to do something. Well, as a teacher, what sort of knowledge do you need to have, right? And it's communication, it's reading and writing. At least right now today, right, being able to produce something of decent quality, you need to have a decent understanding of the domain. You need to be able to communicate, right? And which means being able to read and write and speak in a direct way. And so those skills, I think, transfer. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, but who knows? And a company could prove me wrong tomorrow. I have no idea. Anyway, so that's the end of our episode. So please feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Eugenia, reach out to Paul. And it was so nice to get to talk to both of you about AI assessment, metacognition, and everything else.
Likewise. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Paul. It was nice meeting you.
Absolutely. What a treat. I look forward to doing it again at some point in the future.
Hopefully not at like 6 in the morning.
That's right.